Amat nerat ike tesolderat igmeru.
Hi all, Dave here again. Welcome to another video. Thank you for once again giving me some of your time. This video is something of a follow-up to my last video. In my last video I discussed the claim atheism requires faith, and in it I discussed how there was a current concerted effort to redefine the term antitheism. I also mentioned that I had my suspicions about why it is happening, and that I would discuss them in a future video. Well, unsurprisingly, this is that video. This video will not be arguing that there is a singular and unchangeable definition of antitheism. Words simply don't work like that. The meaning of words can change, and words can have multiple meanings, with those meanings dependent on time, place, and context. Anyone that understands how language works understands those things. So this video is not arguing for a singular definition of antitheism, or that it is wrong to change the definition of antitheism. Instead, this video will look at how there is a concerted effort to redefine antitheism, what that means to the definition of atheism, and some of the reasons I think this concerted effort is going on, and why I think this redefinition should be pushed back against, not only by atheists that use the definition believe God does not exist, but by all atheists. As the video goes on, I will expand on these thoughts. While I looked at the definition of antitheism in the previous video, I will begin by having a brief look at it again here for those who haven't watched that video. I apologize to those who watched the previous video for repeating something that was in that video. Understanding that antitheism was previously defined as opposition to belief in gods is an important part of the discussion though. If you wish to skip this part, I will put chapters into the video description and you can simply skip to that. To begin with, let's go through a few dictionary entries for the word antitheism, as well as a few other sources. When discussing the definition of atheism, many atheists will go to Google and do a search for the definition of atheism. Then they will throw out the definition included in the search results. So let's begin there, just as many discussions of the definition of atheism do. With that said, here is the result of the Google search for the definition of antitheism. As can be seen, the definition listed is opposition to belief in the existence of a god or gods. The same holds true for the definition listed in the Collins Online Dictionary, as can be seen in the image on screen. And the image on screen now is the free dictionary entry for antitheism. As we can see, that too lists antitheism as the opposition to belief in God or gods. And finally, we have the entry for antitheism in Wikipedia. So that seems like enough entries from various sources to show that antitheism is commonly used to describe the opposition to belief in God or gods. There's one more site that you may come across when doing the search though, and that site is defineatheism.com. You can see the relevant screenshot on screen now. Defineatheism.com is a site run by Canadian atheists, which is headed by Randolph Richardson. Randolph Richardson is one of those that is spearheading this attempt to redefine the term antitheism. His name will come up later. A lot, but for now, let's move on to the claim that the version of antitheism as described by Randolph Richardson is a common usage. Looking at the tweet on screen now, you can see that Randolph Richardson claims that antitheism, defined as the belief God does not exist, is one that is in common usage. A quick search of Twitter shows that it definitely is one that is in use by many atheists, and one that has been used for a while now. On screen now is a tweet that goes back to 2013, and this is one that goes back to 2016. And here's one from 2018 that Randolph Richardson himself posted. And here's one from 2020, and here's a couple from 2021. And finally, one from about a week ago, at the time of writing the script anyway. So, as we can see, this other usage of antitheism has been around for quite a while. You can also see the keywords I used in the images of the tweets I showed if you want to replicate the search. There is probably more out there if anyone cares to research more deeply. All I really wanted to show here, though, is that it has been in use for a while. The question here, though, is whether or not it is in common usage, as Randolph Richardson claims. Well, the first thing that jumps out to me here is the fact that the belief God does not exist version of antitheism does not appear in any of the dictionary entries that I showed earlier. Why is this important? Well, it seems a little obvious, but I'll state it anyway. In order for a word to get into a dictionary, the word must be in common usage. Hence why we find the word antitheism in the dictionary. The same holds true for its definition as well. The definitions listed are those that are in common usage. In order for a word and its meaning to get into the dictionary, it has to be widespread enough for that usage of that word to get the attention of lexicographers, as can be seen in the image on screen now. The lexicographers pay attention to changes in language, using a wide variety of sources. These changes in words and meanings are then collected and cited with context and source. All of these citations are kept in a database, and if there is evidence that it is widespread enough, then either the word or the new meaning is added into the dictionary. More about that can be read in the image on screen now. So, if antitheism as belief God does not exist was in common usage, then we ought to see it listed in at least some of the dictionaries, yet we do not. It could be argued that the meaning has not been in common use for long enough to have made it into dictionaries, of course. But think back to the image I showed first in the screenshots from Twitter. That tweet was dated almost 10 years ago. So even in the almost 10 years since that tweet, it has not entered into any dictionaries. On screen now is a screenshot from dictionary.com listing the criteria that lexicographers use to determine if a word or meaning should be added to a dictionary. It could still be argued that it not appearing in dictionaries is not evidence that it is not in common use, of course. However, it does mean that in the last 10 years at least, it has not met the criteria in the image. Perhaps it simply takes longer than that to get into a dictionary, or perhaps its usage is not as common as people like Randolph Richardson attempt to portray it. A search on Twitter for the term antitheism will bring up many people using it in the sense of anti-religion, but few using it to describe the belief God does not exist. So I would argue here that rather than simply not having made it into the dictionary yet, the word simply is not commonly used to describe the belief God does not exist. What I would argue is that the use of antitheism to describe the belief God does not exist is common usage in certain circles, rather than common as in how people use the word. When someone like Randolph Richardson states that its usage is common, as he does in the tweet on screen now, he is overstating the case. He is either drawing a faulty inductive inference based on his experiences and then applying that small portion to the whole, or he's just being dishonest, something we will look at later. Let's first consider the circles in which this usage of antitheism could be considered common. People that assert that antitheism is the belief God does not exist are a part of the group that argues that there is a singular definition of atheism, with that definition being a lack of belief in gods, or some variation of that. People like Randolph Richardson, Matt Dillahunty, and Aaron Ra are among some of those championing this cause. As we saw earlier in the video, Randolph Richardson promotes this usage of antitheism on his site defineatheism.com, and also agreed that Matt Dillahunty used antitheism in that way too. And what's on screen now is an example of Aaron Ra also promoting this idea. So it seems that this usage is mostly confined to atheist activists, and those promoting the idea that atheism is simply a lack of belief in gods. I have also heard it used by people who are not necessarily promoting the idea of a singular definition of atheism, though they do not argue that atheism does not also incorporate the belief God does not exist. It's usually mentioned in the sense that some people call the belief God does not exist antitheism. While they may be normalizing the term, I do not consider them to be pushing for this definition in the same way that I would consider someone like Randolph Richardson, Matt Dillahunty, or any of those in the tweets mentioned earlier. It is on those promoting this idea that the video will focus on. The fact that we'll be focusing on people promoting and arguing for the idea that there is only one correct definition of atheism should give some indication as to one of the reasons for redefining the term antitheism. There are many atheists who push the idea that there is a singular definition of atheism. This goes for atheists on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as bigger names like Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ra. When you search for the Canadian Atheists or the definition of atheism, you will also see Randolph Richardson advertising the official definition of atheism, as can be seen on screen now. And the image on screen at the moment is taken from another of Randolph's sites, Atheist Frontier, a site which he uses as a reference on his site defineatheism.com in order to give a veneer of authority and being researched. The organization American Atheists also promotes the idea that there is a singular definition of atheism, though they are smart enough to not include official in their description. They do, however, explicitly state both that atheism is one thing and that the belief God does not exist is not a part of atheism. So here we can see various organizations and people pushing the idea that there is a singular definition of atheism and that the belief God does not exist is not included in that definition. This gives us our first reason for this push to redefine the term antitheism. To some extent, though, atheists already do admit and argue that different types of atheists exist. When we think of the modifiers agnostic and gnostic that are used in conjunction with atheist and atheism, we can already see this. Though of course both of these share the lack of belief definition, with gnostic and agnostic referring to claims of knowledge. There is obviously an acceptance here that different atheists have differing positions on the question of God's existence, though. There is a problem here too. The Gnostic atheist position as a person that lacks a belief in God and claims to know for certain that God does not exist is not the equivalent of the strong atheism and strong atheist position, which is the belief God does not exist. There seems to be no problem with admitting that there are different forms of atheism from those that push for the singular definition. The problem seems to come in when admitting that there are different forms of atheism outside of this lack of belief definition. But it's a trivial matter to show that these other definitions exist and are in use, though. The definition can be found in various dictionaries and in various books discussing atheism. So to deny that these other definitions of atheism exist is simply to deny reality. To argue that those other definitions are invalid is to deny how language works. Simply put, to deny these other definitions of atheism is to be irrational. This brings us one step closer to the reasons why people like Randolph Richardson are so keen on redefining antitheism. There are ideological reasons behind this shifting of what antitheism means. For quite a while now, there has been a push for the idea that atheism is a term with a singular definition. As mentioned though, there is ample evidence to show that atheism is a word with multiple definitions. Evidence can be provided from dictionaries, books discussing atheism, various encyclopedia, as well as from atheists themselves. All of those same arguments that are used to support the idea that atheism is a lack of belief in gods also support the idea that atheism is the belief God does not exist. From it's in the dictionary, to the etymology supports it, to words get their definitions from usage. These arguments apply to both definitions. If those pushing for a singular definition of atheism deny that these arguments support the definition belief God does not exist, then they are denying that these arguments support the definition a lack of belief in gods. as all of those arguments that are used to support the claim that atheism is a lack of belief in gods also support other definitions. This leaves only a few options for those promoting a singular definition. The first option is to simply deny that the arguments support both definitions of the word atheism, and to dogmatically keep asserting that there is only one definition of atheism. This seems like the most irrational option, as it is simply denying reality and clinging onto a false belief. When pushing an ideology, though, the rationality of it comes second to the promotion of the ideology. People like Aron Ra, someone often found choosing this option, does not have to worry about looking irrational, though. His fans have already bought into the ideology and will take his word over the word of others. Their buying of the ideology also means that they will, as Aron Ra does, discount the rational arguments in favor of the ideology. Another option is to simply hold one's hands up and say, I was wrong. Atheism does have multiple meanings. And this would be the most rational option to take. Not just for the average atheist on spaces like Twitter and Facebook, but also bigger names like Aron Ra, Matt Dillahunty, and Randolph Richardson. The arguments and evidence lead to this conclusion after all, as well as it being true. Yet this is something we do not see them doing. This is one of the things that leads to the conclusion that this push for a singular definition of atheism is ideological. After all, if it was driven by truth and by rationality, then they would choose the rational and true option. Instead, they continue to push the idea that there is a singular definition of atheism, regardless of the fact that it is both a false and irrational conclusion. There is a lot that could be said about this refusal to admit that atheism does not have a singular definition, but it is enough to say that it is ideologically driven, as well as an irrational and false claim. Which leads us to the other option that is left for those pushing this ideological version of atheism. They can simply use another word to define the belief that God does not exist, and then claim that that is the word that is now used to describe the belief God does not exist. And this brings us to the redefinition of antitheism. On the face of it, it seems a pretty reasonable approach. Those that believe God does not exist are still considered to be atheist, as they still lack a belief in gods, so therefore still fall under the category of atheist. It is just that they are also an antitheist, not much different to the idea of the agnostic and Gnostic distinction. So rather than there being agnostic atheist and Gnostic atheist, there is also the addition of antitheist atheist. Seems reasonable, right? Well, if the reason this redefinition is happening is one of clarity, then it seems to add ambiguity to the term antitheism. As we saw in the beginning of the video, antitheism has traditionally meant the opposition to belief in God and religion. So instead of the word atheism having multiple meanings, this means that the term antitheism now has multiple meanings. So when someone declares that they are an antitheist, it now becomes unclear as to whether or not this means that they oppose belief in God and religion, or if it means they believe God does not exist. Those behind and in support of this redefinition may answer something like, well, this just means that we have to ask what they mean when they use the term. And that's true, of course. Asking the individual what they mean by the term will clear up any confusion. However, this holds true of the word atheism and atheist too. Simply asking what they mean by the terms atheism and atheist clears up any confusion that might be had there too. In fact, many atheists argue that in a conversation we should ask the person what they mean by the term atheist and then gear the conversation around their usage. It also means that it avoids the irrationality and falsity of arguing that the term atheism has a singular definition. So then, why move the belief God does not exist from the term atheism to the term antitheism then? Let's consider a few of the things we have already looked at so far. Consider first Randolph Richardson's claim that there is an official definition of atheism. Consider too that atheism itself is not an organization. There are atheist organizations, sure. Atheism itself is not an organization though. This means that there can be no official definition of the term atheism. There can be official definitions within atheist organizations, but as a whole there can be no official definition. Think also of groups like American Atheists, who also promote the idea of an authoritative definition in their website, which states that atheism is only the lack of belief in gods. Both Randolph Richardson and American Atheists attempt to give off the image that they are authorities over how the term atheist and atheism is used. Yet at best, they can only be authorities over how members of their organizations use the term. Now, also consider the idea that those that push this singular definition do so in the face of the reality of how words work. They ignore the reality that words can and do have multiple definitions, and that words get their meaning from usage. Pushing this singular definition is the equivalent of denying reality. Not only is it denying reality, but this denial of reality is done in spite of a mountain of evidence against this singular definition idea. To push the dogma of the singular definition, one must not only ignore evidence, but deny that evidence. Something that the pushing of dogma relies on is that the community accepts the dogma as unquestionable and accepts the dogma uncritically. If there are those in the community that question the dogma, or those that promote critical thinking about that dogma, then this threatens the narrative. If the narrative is threatened, then so too is the dogma. This means that the narrative needs to be controlled, which is what the attempt to redefine the term antitheism is about: controlling the narrative and protecting the dogma. Moving the belief God does not exist out of the definition of atheism and into the definition of antitheism allows that narrative to be controlled. As I mentioned earlier, all of the arguments for why atheism is defined as a lack of belief in gods also apply to why atheism is defined as the belief God does not exist. We also saw that to argue against this is also to argue against the definition of atheism as a lack of belief in gods. It is also irrational and false, as I stated previously. So moving the belief God does not exist into the definition of antitheism allows the narrative to change. It gives an appearance that the claim that there is a singular definition of atheism is not just a dogmatic assertion. The narrative becomes, well, yes, atheism used to mean that as well. But the word now used to describe that is antitheism. So atheism now only has one definition. However, just as with Randolph's official definition of atheism, and American atheists claim that atheism is a lack of belief in gods and that's it, this move only applies to those who have already bought the dogma and are now selling the dogma. The narrative applies only to those who are attempting to give off an air of authority in a domain where there is no authority. All of the arguments for why atheism is a polysemous word and why the definition includes the belief God does not exist still apply. The argument that the word for belief God does not exist is now antitheism is designed to appear as if there is objectivity where no such objectivity exists. While it might be true that the word now used for belief God does not exist is antitheism in certain groups, it only applies to those groups. This dogma does not apply outside of those groups and does not apply to those who reject that dogma, which means that the narrative shift needs more in order to keep control of the dogma. And that more is the painting of anti-theists as irrational. A common narrative among those that promote the idea of the singular definition of atheism is that anti-theism is an irrational position to hold. By extension of this, it paints the anti-theist as irrational. The reasoning behind this is that the belief that God does not exist is based on an unfalsifiable proposition, and to believe an unfalsifiable proposition is irrational. Therefore, anti-theism as the belief God does not exist is an irrational position to hold, and anti-theists are irrational for holding that position. It is also argued that it is a faith-based position, no different to believing that God exists. And it is this painting of the belief that God does not exist as a faith-based position that is important to us here. Now, one might argue that this move is being done to help atheists avoid holding irrational positions and to avoid getting caught up in faith-based positions. Something especially important for those coming out of religion and wanting to leave faith-based positions behind them. It may be argued that this is about the promotion of good critical thinking and about the avoidance of irrational positions. However, if that was truly the case, then there would not be the dogmatic pushing of the idea that there is a singular definition of atheism, as that is a position based on irrational beliefs and a position based on the promotion of bad critical thinking. It could also be considered a faith-based position. After all, the position is held uncritically as true, and it is unquestionable, and it is in spite of contradictory evidence. Instead, this is another attempt to protect the narrative of the dogma of the singular definition of atheism. By promoting the idea that it is an irrational and faith-based position, it makes atheists look at it in a negative light, as well as reluctant to adopt the position. This painting of antitheism as irrational and faith-based is done to ensure that those already trapped in the dogma remain in the dogma. It uses the atheist's desire to appear as rational as possible and their fear of once again looking irrational and being caught in dogma to reinforce the narrative of the dogma that there is a singular definition of atheism. It is also used to paint the picture that those that believe God does not exist are irrational outsiders to atheism. They might fall under the definition of atheist in the sense that they lack a belief in God, sure, but they do not belong in the group of atheists. They are in fact a separate group. A group that only those that are irrational and willing to accept things based on faith belong to. It is the group for those that challenge the common narrative and those that challenge the dogmatic assertions of the larger group. In other words, the redefining of antitheism is being done in order to create a naughty corner, where those unwilling to follow the dogma of the larger group will be put. And that is where they will stay until they were willing to play ball with the ones pushing the dogma. In other words, it is the place where those considered heretics to the dogma of the singular definition of atheism are put. There is so much more I could say about this move to redefine antitheism as the belief God does not exist, such as how one of the arguments for why atheism is a lack of belief in gods only is that people don't get to redefine words to suit their purpose, or the argument that words have meanings and you don't get to make up your own meaning. However, the video has already gone on long enough. I have no doubts that 99% of the people have already tuned out, and that 100% of those that push the idea that atheism has a singular definition have tuned out. For the tiny fraction of those that made it all the way through, thank you. Hopefully it has been made clear that this redefinition of antitheism is not one done in the name of clarity, but instead done in the name of conformity. For if it was being done in the name of clarity, then an entirely new word would have been coined, rather than simply moving the definition into an already existing, already well-established, and commonly used word with a specific meaning. Hopefully, it should also have become clear that it is not being done in the name of critical thinking or in the name of helping people to avoid faith-based positions, as it is being done in order to promote and protect an already existing faith-based dogma, with that faith-based dogma being the pushing of atheism as a lack of belief in gods, and that's it. And those that do that pushing of this dogma, at the top level at least, give off a false veneer of authority about how the term is used, with some, like Randolph Richardson, even willing to create separate websites that cite each other in order to make it look as though it is well-sourced and authoritative. As I stated in the intro, the video would hopefully make clear why all atheists should be against this redefinition of the term antitheism. It is not because it is irrational or because it is wrong to change the meaning of a word. It's perfectly fine and normal for language to change over time and for words to take on additional meanings. Instead, we should be against it because it's pushing false beliefs and pushing dogma in the name of atheism. Those who push this dogma take advantage of those that have left their faith and are trapping them in an entirely different kind of faith. It is using their inclination towards dogmatic thinking to trap them into a different kind of dogma. The redefinition of anti-theism is also being done to exclude certain people from the atheist community, much in the same way that the religions many atheists argue against do. The redefining of anti-theism, as well as the promotion and protection of the dogma of the singular definition, goes against everything that many skeptics, critical thinkers, and atheists claim to be against. It teaches uncritical thinking, unquestionable claims, the denial of reality, and the holding of false beliefs. It should be pushed back against, regardless of whether it comes from the average atheist on Twitter and Facebook, or if it comes from official organizations like Canadian Atheists and Randolph Richardson, or it comes from bigger names like Ron Ra and Matt Dillahunty. Unless we want to see atheism become little more than the parody that South Park painted it as, of course. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully the discussion in the video was at least interesting, even if you disagree with it. In my next video, I'll be returning to the Better Skepticism series and creating part 3, which will discuss the idea of the brain in a vat and similar kind of thought experiments. For now, take care, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye.